Sara Sanchez is going to be joining us here. She is a baseball analyst and podcaster whose work can be found at Pitcher List, Baseball Headquarters, and Sports Blog Nation's Bleed Cubbie Blue. Sara joins us from Chicago. Sara, I don't know how much of the Shohei Ohtani conversation you just heard. Obviously, in Chicago, Cubs fans were hopeful, probably somewhat pessimistic, if I had to guess. But the competitive balance tax and deferred money for 10 years and all that, it just kind of seems, I don't know, like a little cheap. Like the competitive balance tax isn't actually benefiting anybody but the big market clubs.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I was following this about as closely as one can. In Chicago, we were hoping it would be Chicago for Shohei Ohtani in the coming year, but not the case. I will say the Cubs are one of the teams that should be able to go toe-to-toe with the Dodgers. The fact that Jed Hoyer has chosen not to do that for hashtag reasons is totally a front office decision that has very little to do with the money the Chicago Cubs make. They are another team that controls their own network, so they're not dependent on some of the RSN money that some of these teams like the Padres or the Diamondbacks are losing, that they're going to have problems keeping up with a team like the Dodgers. But the Cubs are not in that position. By all accounts, it appears their offer was pretty short and that they were not really down to the final two teams, which it looks like were the Blue Jays and the Dodgers. But let's be clear. If there are 5 teams in baseball who can compete with the Dodgers on this, the Chicago Cubs are one of them.
Yeah. And Sara, nice to have you here. I know Jed Hoyer was also talking about how, sometimes people don't want to go to options B, C, and D until option A is gone. And with Shohei Ohtani gone, and as you mentioned, we found out later the Cubs were not one of the finalists, contrary to what some early reports were. What's kind of the response around finding out that the Cubs were not finalists and now looking towards options B, C, and D? Is there optimism? Is there excitement? Is there pessimism following the fact that the Cubs did not land Ohtani?
I think there's a lot of question marks, and it's going to be really interesting to see what Jed Hoyer does next. One of the things that has been true here for a few years now is that the Cubs really haven't landed one of the top free agents in the market, going back all the way to like 2015 when they got Jason Hayward to sign here with a deal that was a little bit short of what the Cardinals were offering at the time. And Jason Hayward, for the record, is still the largest contract in the history of the Chicago Cubs at his 8 years, $187 million. So it's easy to see why they're missing out on these guys who are getting $280, $360 million a year when all of your contract offers that are 9 digits start with a 1. Beyond that, I will say that I think that the Cubs have some moves in them, a couple that are from Philadelphia, actually, so definitely worth talking about. But I'm not even sure they're going to be in on Cody Bellinger, who was so great for this team last season. They offered him a 1-year sort of pillow contract to reestablish his market, and Bellinger took full advantage of that. I can't imagine that the Cubs are going to top an offer that the Giants would give to Cody Bellinger or that the Blue Jays at this point would give to Cody Bellinger. And so I think that they're probably going to wind up third in that sweepstakes, which means they're going to be right back to where they've been before, sort of shopping at the higher end of the mid-tier free agents. And don't get me wrong, like a guy like Dansby Swanson is a nice player, but Dansby Swanson was not one of the top 3 shortstop contracts that went out last year. He was the 4th one, and it was the most reasonable one. It's sort of like you're shopping for a Prius while everybody else is out there shopping for Ferraris.
Yeah, and we'll get to one of our old friends, Rhys Hoskins, who might be on the Cubs' radar. So what is kind of the expectation? Is there a thought that Cubs could go after a Jordan Montgomery, a Yamamoto still, Blake Snell? Like what is the top of the checklist here for Cubs Nation?
It's a great question. I think the Cubs really need 3 things, and they can kill 2 of these birds with 1 stone. They need a first baseman or they need a third baseman, and it's sort of dependent on where they think Christopher Morel can slot in, because Christopher Morel is a really talented 24-year-old kid who's his home run numbers last year. He hit 37 home runs across AAA and the majors last year, and I think that you can slot him in somewhere for the Chicago Cubs. But the question is, he hasn't really had a defensive position to date. And so is he going to be your third baseman? If so, you probably do focus on a guy like Rhys Hoskins. And he's exactly the type of contract Jed Hoyer loves, right? Like you give that guy a couple of years of a high AAV, let him reestablish his value. He can hit free agency again. This is like textbook Jed Hoyer. So I think that Rhys is a great fit for the Chicago Cubs at first base, especially considering that Jeimer Candelario has already signed with the Reds. I thought he was also a pretty great corner infielder fit for the Chicago Cubs. The other guy that they might look to if they decide to go the third base route rather than the first base route is Matt Chapman, who I think is probably going to get. Now, this is a little bit more outside of Judd's comfort zone. He's probably going to get 6 years, $150 million, if you believe the MLB trade rumors estimates that are out there. But Matt Chapman would fit in really nicely at Wrigley Field. Even in a down year last year, he had a WRC plus of 110. So he was 10% better than your league average hitter at bringing in runs. And I think that Matt Chapman would upgrade the Cubs defensively at third base, give them a middle of the order bat, and would be a really nice fit for this team.
Yeah. I mean, listen, you're talking about Jed Hoyer's focus more on wanting to have guys that come in and prove it and develop versus just always spending money. Can relate in some sense. But as you talk about Rhys Hoskins specifically, we've mentioned on our show many times, we want Rhys Hoskins to go somewhere where he can shine. He can do well. We feel like the Cubs would be a spot for that. We don't want to see Rhys Hoskins go somewhere where, he's not going to be able to have opportunities and his career is going to go left. So it feels like the Cubs could be a great fit for Rhys based off of our experiences and what we know and love about Rhys. But on the other side for the Cubs, as you mentioned, first baseman, how are you guys feeling about Rhys in terms of what he would add to the clubhouse, to the team as a first baseman and as a great guy that can smash balls out of the park?
I love Rhys Hoskins, and I love this for the Chicago Cubs. I think that Rhys Hoskins does a couple of things that the Cubs have not had since Anthony Rizzo was manning first base over there for the Chicago Cubs. He's a power first baseman. So the Cubs have not really had somebody who is going to hit 30 home runs a season for you at that first base spot. And frankly, I know that Rhys Hoskins isn't quite at the same defensive prowess level that Anthony Rizzo was, but just having a guy that knows what he's doing over there is a huge help. I watched way too many guys who were third baseman, Patrick Wisdom, looking at you, or outfielders, Trey Mancini, looking at you, trying to hold down first base, and the number of errors, just mental errors and things that cost the Cubs runs down the stretch from those guys was apparent to anyone who was watching this team regularly. So I think Rhys Hoskins, from a clubhouse fit, from a trying to reestablish his value fit, hitting 30 home runs, right field power plays very well at Wrigley Field, would be a great fit for this Chicago Cubs team. The one thing that I did not mention that is definitely on the Cubs wish list as well this offseason, they need a starting pitcher, and it's going to be interesting to see who that starting pitcher is. You mentioned a few names. I think of the names you mentioned, Jordan Montgomery, Blake Snell. I actually really like Montgomery as a fit for this team. I think that he is exactly the type of guy that Jed Hoyer loves. It is a very good defense up the middle for the Chicago Cubs team. And so a pitch to contact guy can overperform here, as we saw from Justin Steele, as we saw from Marcus Stroman. And I think Jordan Montgomery would really fit that mark.
Yeah, Sarah, this is a question I asked Renee and our producer Tyler here in the show before we got to it. I'm kind of like, NL depressed about the Dodgers 1, 2, 3 in the order. The baseball fan in me, not the Phillies fan in me, goes, my God, Mookie Betts, Freddie Freeman, Shohei Ohtani might be the greatest 3 combinations of hitters in the history of the game. Do you kind of feel that National League kind of now, of course, they can be beat, but it does feel like, damn, the National League really just went through Los Angeles with this move.
It's interesting to me because the Dodgers certainly look like a super team, and the Atlanta Braves, for that matter, look like a super team too. But baseball is such a quirky sport.
And no pitching to where you're probably going. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, neither of those teams has made it to the World Series in the last couple of seasons, despite being absolute juggernauts. And you have to get hot at the right time. You have to have pitching as well. And I think what we saw with the Braves last season and with the Dodgers this last season in the playoffs is their pitching ran out of gas. They didn't have the ability to get it done down the stretch. And one of the things I like for the Chicago Cubs, which I cannot say the same thing for the Phillies, unfortunately, but playing in the NL Central, it's a lot easier path to get yourself a ticket to the dance, right? Winning that NL Central with the Brewers kind of on a downward trend, the Cardinals sort of trying to reset after a year that was historically bad for the St. Louis Cardinals. The NL Central is a winnable division. The Chicago Cubs clearly have money to spend if they were even in the conversation to discuss signing Shohei Ohtani. So I feel like the Cubs can reset pretty quick here and jump to the top of the Central really fast.
Yeah. Sarah, you're sharing some great nuggets of information. I love it. I know our own Tyler Zulli actually had a question for you, and I'm not going to ask it for him. I'm going to let him ask it. Our producer Tyler's got
I appreciate
a
that.
great question that he wants to ask.
So, Sarah, you were talking about, Rhys Hoskins potentially being, the move at first, moving Morel to third, just strictly by knowing what Rhys Hoskins is as a defender and watching Morel a little bit and looking at the numbers in the D-WAR kind of both being in the negative. Is the bank kind of the elite level middle infield play kind of covering the corners a little bit more? Like, with Swanson and
Two
Horner.
Gold Glovers,
Yeah,
in
with
the
Swanson
middle.
and Horner up the middle, is that kind of like, all right, your range is an extra step and a half now because we have these two guys on the corner? Is that kind of how you're viewing this?
Well, it's a great question because the big question mark with Christopher Morel is where can he play where his glove is not going to be a liability. And to be clear, I think with Christopher Morel, the bigger problem is he hasn't had a chance to establish himself at any one position. And the place he looks most comfortable is second base, where you've got a Gold Glover and Nico Horner. So giving that spot to Christopher Morel is a really hard sell to the Cubs when they want to have that up the middle defense with Swanson and Horner. I think that Christopher Morel probably needs to play every game of spring training that he can play healthily at third so the Cubs can see what, if anything, he can do there. And if it's not going to work, then at least you find that out in spring training. He has a live arm. He has one of the strongest arms in the league. I think it's like 98th or 99th percentile. It's also like a Sean Dunston arm, right? Like that's a cannon that that every now and again the ball just sails on him. And you're absolutely correct that the combination of Christopher Morel and Rhys Hoskins could be a potential disaster if he can't get that under control. So I think you find out in spring training if that is something he can get under control. If he can, you let him take third base there. If he can't, one of those guys becomes a DH and the other one takes first.
Yeah, Sarah. So the last thing before we let you go, we appreciate your time, of course. I have to put you in the hot seat a little bit. Obviously, we've all been watching closely around all of the moves and roster changes that we've seen. The biggest one was Juan Soto off the board, then Shohei Ohtani. Obviously, there's still big players up for grabs and someone like Yamamoto. What are you expecting next that's going to kind of shake the baseball world in terms of a roster move that you're anticipating? Doesn't have to be Cubs or Phillies specific, but looking across the league, what are you thinking is going to happen next?
I think that the next big thing is the bidding war for Cody Bellinger. And as far as I can tell, I think that the two teams that are most likely to land Bellinger, I think the Yankees were a really good spot before they got Soto and Verdugo. I think the Yankees are probably out on Cody Bellinger now. So I think this becomes a bidding war between the San Francisco Giants and the Toronto Blue Jays. And that is super interesting to me because the Giants have been trying to give guys hundreds of millions of dollars for multiple seasons now, and they have not been able to do it. And if you were the San Francisco Giants, you just watched Shohei Ohtani sign the biggest contract in the history of sports for your rival. The only way you can counter in this market is signing Cody Bellinger and taking the Dodgers' former MVP and former Rookie of the Year and putting him in center field for San Francisco. So I'm really curious to see how that lines up. The Blue Jays are also super motivated here. Cody Bellinger would play nicely in that lineup. And those are two teams that have demonstrated they have the money to spend. They just need someone to take it. So I'm curious to see how that bidding war goes down.
So on that note, as we wrap up, do Cubs fans want him back at that kind of market value? Because to me, like I don't want to say risky because he did bounce back. The pedigree was always there, but he had 2 really bad years. And that type of money, like it does seem a little bit risky to me. Obviously a great year last year. But do Cubs fans want him back at that kind of market value?
Really depends on what Cubs fan you're talking to. I did a deep dive on Cody Bellinger in about July or August. And the thing that is mystifying about if you just look at his Baseball Savant page, he dropped the K rate considerably. I think he got it down to 16, 17% last season, but everything else doesn't really look like he fixed all that much. The barrel rate was the lowest of his career. The hard hit rate is down. Now, I also watched him just kind of do a lot of that little like wedge shot over the second baseman, that shot that's no longer an automatic out because of the shift rules. And so he can be an effective bat in the lineup there, and he does still have some power. But if you look at his Baseball Savant page, it's really a study in contradictions. It's like he got the K rate down, he became a much better hitter, and also the power does not seem to be MVP Bellinger. It's something different.